Hey everyone, welcome to our 8th seminar of this year's Sport and Human Performance Research Centre lecture series. I'm going to hand everyone over to Dr. John Kiley, who's going to introduce our speaker today. We'll take a Q&A at the end, guys, as well. Okay. Over to you, John.
Hi folks, welcome along. So it is, everyone says it's my pleasure to introduce, but it is my genuine introduce Professor Kerry McGawley. I'm a big fan of Kerry and her work. I think she effectively straddles having been a competitive athlete, still being a competitive athlete, being an accomplished academic professor, and also a coach, both UEFA qualified coach in football and a triathlon coach. So all the necessary ingredients that someone like me would look for in a professional operating and talking about these topics. She's also the director at the Swedish Winter Sports Research Center, and she is a lead for Orico's female athlete section. Okay, I think that's a lot there. We could be talking about it for a long time, but they're the headlines. I'll pass it over to Kerry. I hope you enjoyed the talk. You're muted, Kerry.
I'm back on. I was just saying, can everyone hear me okay? So all good. Hopefully I'm on now. And yeah, likewise, I think the feeling's mutual. It's really nice to be invited along to this series by Frank and John, and to have that introduction by you, John, who you're also somebody that, yeah, big fan of and respect your work. So nice to be involved in these kind of applied seminars and lectures and so on, and have hopefully some really good discussions at the end as well. So I've prepared a session today and some slides on, I guess, what I'm quite passionate about at the moment. Well, I mean, I always have been in terms of female athletes and supporting female athletes, but that's recently become quite specific to my own research kind of profile and projects as well. So yeah, the title for today is An Individualised Approach to Supporting Female Athletes. And if I can move the slides on. Yep, this is a little bit about what we're going to cover hopefully today, and like I say, hopefully have some nice discussions with Q&A and so on at the end as well. We'll see how much time I take up talking. But it's going to be quite a bit of focus on the menstrual cycle, and also kind of hormonal cycles. I mean, we're also going to touch upon the use of hormonal contraceptives as well, which obviously affects the menstrual cycle, and how that affects all exercising women and or female athletes, depending on how we define our cohort that we're working with, how it affects us all differently, and whether you're a man in the room listening, hopefully you're kind of coming into contact with female athletes or exercising women, and you might be supporting them or researching around them, or you might be one yourself or have some experience of this as a woman or a female athlete yourself as well. But we often kind of talk about, or men often say to me, oh, I find it really difficult because I obviously don't have any experience of this. I've never had a menstrual cycle. I'm never going to have one. And I do understand that, and I get that, but I don't think it's hugely different for us women either, because we only have ourselves as a case study. And as you'll see as we go on, you know, women experience their menstrual and hormonal cycles really differently. So just because we're women, you know, all of us women know that doesn't naturally make us experts. So if you are one of the men in the room, you don't need to feel hugely kind of less knowledgeable or underprepared in this compared to women around you, because I think, you know, none of us really have a huge amount of information or knowledge. And that's affected by the fact that we just haven't really talked about this and haven't really researched it hugely historically. But a little bit of focus anyway. In this session, we will explore how the menstrual cycle, I've already kind of mentioned hormonal cycles, hormonal contraceptives as well, how they affect physiology, performance and symptoms, so kind of subjective experiences that female athletes will have along the way, and discuss how monitoring and managing menstrual cycles and symptoms can help female athletes with their training and performance. So hopefully some kind of practical ideas as well of what we can do with the kind of research and information that we have got, and how we can produce more and better research going forward. So that's kind of a bit of a structure of hopefully what I'll cover in this talk. So just a real quick start. I'm not going to get into endocrinology or far into kind of sex hormones, but a very, very sort of crude overview. Female predominant sex hormones are estrogens and progestogens. And this might be something that you know already, hopefully. I'm not sure what level everybody's at, but this is very basic. While male dominant sex hormones are androgens, and they're made predominantly in the testes, and in women, our sex hormones are made predominantly in the ovaries. So that's kind of the very crude difference between men and women, males and females, biologically in terms of our sex hormones. And that does have an impact on obviously what we're going to come and talk about in a second in terms of menstrual cycles. But back to the hormones in general, all types of hormones, so women and men have concentrations of all of these hormones, but to different degrees. So I've already kind of used that term, male and female dominant sex hormones. So it's just that we have a lot higher levels of estrogens as women, and men have a lot higher levels of testosterone, for example. And hormones have catabolic, so kind of breaking down, and anabolic building up effects. And like I said, I'm not going to get into the details of that, but these hormones and how they function affect mood, behavior, body composition, physiological things that affect performance like red blood cell production, immune function, and a lot more. So hopefully you can kind of get to think, well, if we've got quite different concentrations of hormones, and in women you'll see in a minute, you know, how they fluctuate over the cycle, that is going to affect psychological characteristics as well as physiological characteristics differently in the two sexes. And as well as there being kind of these large differences between the sexes and men and women, there are also large between individual variations. So within a female cohort, there's going to be large variation in hormone levels, but even within any given person from time to time. So for a woman from 1 month to the next, or over a lifespan, they can be affected by stress and overload and overtraining, for example, or high loads of training, lack of recovery, sleep. So all these things kind of affect our hormone concentration, and they affect different athletes physically, physiologically and psychologically differently because of these different kind of levels and concentrations. So that's kind of as far as I'm going to go in just terms of a very brief overview, and just to set the scene a little bit. And now we're going to focus a little bit more on women specifically and the female hormonal cycle. So hopefully for a lot of people, this is just going to be a quick reminder. At the start of phase 1, so on the left-hand side of that diagram, with the arrow pointing up, that's when we would typically experience a menstrual bleed. At the beginning of our cycle, day 1 is the definition of when we get our first bleed of the monthly-ish cycle. And at that time, our estrogen and progesterone levels are low. And then you can see that estrogen throughout that follicular phase increases until you get a peak in estrogen during the ovulatory phase. Then you get a dip again and a second kind of slightly lower peak in that luteal phase of estrogen, which is the darker purple. And that kind of lighter pinky purple colour, that's the progesterone. And you can see that that's suppressed all the way through that follicular phase. It starts to increase through the ovulatory phase. And post-ovulation, it reaches its peak in that luteal phase and then drops down again. So that's just kind of a very rough overview. A textbook will typically talk about 28 days, but that range can be quite different for different women. And we normally define a eumenorrheic normal kind of menstrual cycle as being anywhere between 21 and 35 days. This is a nice paper by Kirsty Elliott-Sale and colleagues that came out a couple of years ago now in Sports Medicine, and I just think it's nice because it gives people that don't necessarily know too much about this, or don't really have too much of an idea of how to factor the menstrual cycle or hormonal concentrations into kind of research studies, was the idea with this paper, to give kind of, as the title alludes to there, methodological consideration for studies in sports science, and how we can make sure that we're controlling for hormonal concentrations as well as possible if it's relevant to our research question. So you can see here that in that figure that they produce, that there's kind of 4 key phases that are represented by distinct hormonal profiles, and characterized by different estrogen, which is the yellow line in this figure, and progesterone, which is the green dotted line. So you can see that phase 1 is what they call their low hormonal concentration phase. Phase 2 is where you've got that peak in estrogen that we talked about, which is pre-ovulation. The purple dotted line is the luteinizing hormone. So in phase 3 there, that's the ovulation, which is directly after that peak in LH. And then phase 4 is what we would typically call a high hormone phase, where you've got both high concentrations of progesterone and estrogen at the same time. And there's different tracking methods that you can use if you're going to do research in this field, and the gold kind of standard, the ideal thing that we would do would be actually to measure blood hormone concentrations. Unfortunately, that's really expensive, so it doesn't often happen in research studies, which is kind of problematic, because what a lot of studies have historically done is just use this 28-day cycle, which, like I said, and that's even marked on this figure, that's just a textbook kind of very average picture of what any kind of hormonal cycle would look like for any individual. So if you just do calendar counting, you're going to get it wrong for most people in your study. That's the kind of issue. So there's that kind of worst case scenario bronze level of tracking method, which will be calendar based counting. So you would do some kind of period of data collection in advance of your study proper, where you would get an idea of how long each of your participants' menstrual cycles are. So, for example, mine is quite consistently 32 days, and I know that from months and months and months of tracking over time. And if you've got the funding, it would also be ideal to use kind of urinary ovulation kits as well to measure that surge in LH, that purple dotted line, because that gives you an idea then of when ovulation occurs. You can use fertility tests for that, and then you sort of know when the luteal phase is about to start and the follicular phase has ended. So that's also sort of a very brief overview as to how you can be a bit more specific with your research, or even with your tracking if you're a coach working with athletes, for example. And this is just a quick one as well, because this is all just kind of intro stuff. This is just to kind of remind people or show people what hormonal contraceptive use will do. And you can see that the hard blue and the hard green lines is a naturally menstruating woman, whereas the dotted lines are hormonal contraceptive use, hormone profiles of the estradiol and the progesterone that's just suppressed. The endogenous, so the naturally occurring sex dominant hormones in women are suppressed when we're using exogenous hormones through a pill or a hormonal coil, for example. So I guess I just kind of wanted to set the scene and give a little bit of background for those that weren't quite up to speed before we get into hopefully what's a little bit more interesting and relevant for this particular talk. And in that, I'm going to just show some data around the effect of the menstrual cycle, MC, and hormonal contraception, HC, those phases on physiological variables, because I think a lot of people know it's being talked about a lot now, how women have typically been excluded from particularly sports science studies, and particularly studies where we're going to measure physiological outcomes, because there's this idea that we're too complicated, we're too variable, and it's going to impact our data and our results if we include women in our studies, which is not acceptable. And I think we have to work around that, because it's not acceptable just to exclude all women from studies because of that. We need to do something better. We can measure women, for example, in that early follicular phase where we know that the hormones are suppressed, or we can standardize where in the cycle we're going to test women. But the other thing is, I'm going to show you a couple of studies now that have actually showed that there is no difference across menstrual cycle phases in a lot of key physiological variables that we would typically measure. And the first one is a study that I was actually involved in writing a couple of years ago now with some Finnish colleagues. And you can see there from the title, Influence of Menstrual Cycle or Hormonal Contraceptive Phase on Physiological Variables Monitored During Treadmill Testing. So just a quick couple of figures and findings from that study. We only included eumenorrheic women, so they're that's the top white boxes, and we tested them in that bleeding phase, in the mid-follicular phase, so that mid-early phase with the rising estrogen, at ovulation, and in that mid-luteal phase, so where you've got the high hormones of estrogen and progesterone. We also had a hormonal contraceptive using group, which are the grey boxes here, and we measured them during their active pill taking days at day 8, day 15, and then those inactive days where you come off the pill, and then during their bleeding phase. So that's just kind of the methodological structure or the design of that study. And this is what we found. These are just kind of some key results. And I mean, I can just read out that kind of results text just to kind of show you the overview of the findings of that study. There were no significant changes in VO2 or blood lactate at the aerobic or anaerobic thresholds across the phases in either the eumenorrheic or the hormonal contraceptive using group. And that's depicted in the figure as well, which that just shows one of the variables. So it's the relative VO2 peak at the 4 different, so just one of those physiological measures at the 4 different phases. For on the left-hand diagram, that's the eumenorrheic group. So you can see the hard black line is the average of the group, and you can see that it just doesn't deviate from 0% difference from phase to phase relative to bleeding. And that was the same for the hormonal contraceptive users on the right-hand side. In terms of significance, there's no significant difference from one phase to the next across those 4 phases in that particular outcome variable, and that was the case for all of those outcome variables as well. But what you can see is all of those dotted lines, which are the individual athletes included in the study, and these were just kind of recreational women, recreationally active, and you can see that there's a lot of variation across those phases, and probably if you tested them again, you would see a lot of variation within individuals as well. So this is just not a consistent finding from cycle to cycle, month to month. And this is a really nice study by some of our colleagues. I wasn't involved in this particular study, but this is colleagues over in at NTNU, in Trondheim in Norway. And this has just been published in MedSci very, very recently, and they found pretty much the same thing. So you can see there, and they didn't look at hormonal contraceptive users in that study, just eumenorrheic, highly trained endurance athletes in this particular study. Menstrual cycle phase has no influence on performance determining variables in endurance trained athletes. I've just highlighted just briefly from PubMed. I mean, you can have a look at this yourself, but just a quick overview of the results there. At a group level, so once again, on average, as a group, there was no effect of menstrual cycle phase on the concentrations of estrogen and progesterone, on peak oxygen uptake, so something that we would typically measure in endurance athletes, even other athletes. Oxygen uptake at 4 millimoles of blood lactate concentration, so a kind of submaximal endurance measure. Time to exhaustion, running economy, mean 30-second power output. And that was over the difference with this study was that they looked over 2 consecutive cycles, and they saw that this was kind of a consistent finding as well. So the conclusions, none of the measured performance determining variables were influenced by menstrual cycle phase or serum estrogen and progesterone concentrations. Some individual patterns could be observed, but there was no indication that any single menstrual cycle phase is consistently associated with improved or impaired VO2 peak, that should say, on a group level. So then you can start asking yourselves, well, at a group level, there isn't actually a difference from phase to phase anyway. So are we justified in excluding women from our studies? Is it more of a concern that we've got a lot of individual variation? And have we ever actually paid attention to individual, because that individual variation is not bigger than normal human performance individual variation anyway from one time point to the next. So it might be that we've been unjustified all this time to exclude women by saying that they're too complicated and they're too variable and they're kind of messing up our results, because there's so many things that are going to affect these variables, these physiological variables, but also performance from day to day anyway, in any exercising individual, whether they're male or female. I'm going to focus a little bit on a few studies now that have looked at performance and also adaptation to training, and how menstrual cycle phases or hormonal contraceptive use affect those different outcome variables. You might have seen these studies. These were a couple of studies that came out from Kerry McGawley, a PhD student with Kirsty Elliott-Sale very recently, or in the last few years, I should say now, actually. These have been cited quite a bit because they're just quite nice systematic reviews, meta-analysis that summarise the literature that we do have, or the information that we do have, which is really quite limited. So that first study on the left-hand side looked at the effects of menstrual cycle phase, so what we've already been talking about, on exercise performance specifically, rather than physiological kind of variables that might affect or predict performance. So a quick summary of that paper, because obviously quite large. They analysed 78 studies, over 1,000 participants, 18 to 40 years old, and basically concluded that, you know, almost half of the studies were deemed of too low quality of evidence to be able to be of any use to answer this question. The effect of the menstrual cycle phase on performance was highly variable between studies. And that's because we see a lot of different methods have been used in the studies. And like I said before, a lot of the methods are not good enough to actually identify different phases of the menstrual cycle. And as a result, general guidelines on exercise performance and how that manifests across the menstrual cycle can't be formed. And instead, we need to be using kind of personalised approaches, which is kind of comes back to the title of what this talk is kind of all about. On the right-hand side there, similar kind of systematic review and meta-analysis, but this looked at the effects of oral contraceptives on exercise performance. Fewer studies have been done looking at this, 42 they found, 590 participants, similar age. And in this case, even more of the studies, or 83%, were of very low, or only kind of moderate quality. So same reasons there, it's the methods that have been used. Obviously with contraceptive use, there's lots and lots of different pills available and forms of contraception available. And if that's not standardized, it's very difficult to measure or to compare results, because all different medications will have different kind of chemical makeups. They concluded a small tendency for performance to be affected by oral contraceptive use. But again, there's kind of the data's not good enough. We've got too little knowledge to be able to provide really clear general recommendations. And again, a personalised approach is recommended. I'm going to spin on to a paper. This is also quite a recent paper, came out last year. And this is another review paper. And there aren't many studies that it's actually a review of other review papers. I'll come to the kind of table of results in a minute. But they conclude in this paper, as the title alludes to, that current evidence shows no influence of women's menstrual cycle phase. So in this case, hormonal contraceptive use wasn't investigated, on acute strength performance or adaptations to resistance exercise training. So these were the review papers that they used in their analysis of reviews. You can see down the second column here in the Blagrove paper, some evidence in favour of no difference, some evidence in favour of no difference. That's kind of repeated, some evidence in favour of no difference. So the evidence isn't very good, and what evidence there is suggests that there's no difference across the menstrual cycle phases. The only kind of difference in review paper results was this fourth one here, Romero-Parra paper. And there you can see that they summarise sufficient evidence in favour of an effect, and that's of an effect of the menstrual cycle phase on acute strength performance or adaptations to strength training. But as you kind of look through this table, there's an asterisk, and they kind of have a bit of a caveat on that paper, and they say that we find these recommendations to be unfounded due to high levels of heterogeneity present within the analysis. So the outcome of these authors' kind of findings and their conclusions is that, again, we haven't got clear-cut enough evidence to say that there's any difference in strength performance or adaptations to resistance exercise training across menstrual cycle phases if we train strength training, for example, in that follicular phase when we're considered to be more anabolic. That doesn't seem to have an effect based on all the evidence that we've got as a more positive effect on strength outcomes. And I think this is quite a nice figure from that paper, because it just kind of shows how we, in our textbook presentations of what a menstrual cycle looks like, I've already mentioned that it's typically talked about being 28 days long. The follicular phase and the luteal phase are typically talked about being kind of 14-ish days each, and the ovulation occurs bang in the middle. But as you can see, and this is also what the Taylor paper found, and I know that Madison, the first author of that paper, has tested so many female athletes, and I've chatted to her quite a bit just about the variation in those luteal phases, follicular phases, where ovulation occurs, whether ovulation occurs at all, how long the bleeding phase might carry on for, and obviously the kind of blood loss and the how heavy the bleeding is from menstrual cycle to menstrual cycle changes, and from person to person. So you've got all these kind of variations as well. So that textbook picture of what a menstrual cycle looks like just doesn't match the reality, where you might have a very long follicular phase, a very long luteal phase, very late ovulation, or like I said, no ovulation at all in some cases. What about perceptions of the athletes themselves? So here's just a bit of a summary of the kind of literature on the effect of the menstrual cycle on symptoms and subjective experiences. And I'm just kind of picking out examples because there's quite a lot of studies that have looked at this now. Here's a few papers, and I mean, you'll be able to go back to these if you want to download and read these papers. But one of Natalie Brown's papers, Elite Female Athletes' Experiences and Perceptions of the Menstrual Cycle on Training and Sport Performance, and these are all pretty recent. There's a paper by Mike Armour and his group there, Australian Female Athlete Perceptions of the Challenges Associated with Training and Competing. So we're getting quite a lot of data on these perceptions and symptoms now. This Guro Stramsoli paper at the bottom there, I'm going to go into a little bit of detail on that one and show you some of the findings from that one. In that paper, they had 140 well-trained endurance athletes, so cross-country skiers and biathletes. And this is just a really nice figure, I think, from that paper. And what it shows is along the x-axis there, you've got the same symptoms are repeated across phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and phase 4. So you don't need to sort of read all the words. They're the same symptoms written in the same order from phase to phase. And you can just see that in phase 1 during bleeding, so during menstruation itself, that's where you get the greatest numbers of, or in this particular study in any case, that's where the greatest number of symptoms were reported. And the greatest ones there were pain in the stomach, bloating, pain in the lower back, mood swings, diarrhea, irritability. They're kind of the first few that I've just read out there. Symptoms are pretty low in those two middle phases, phase 2, phase 3, before and after ovulation. Some women do report actually quite bad symptoms and pain during ovulation, but that doesn't come across in this particular figure. And then you can see that premenstrual as well, so phase 4, 1 to 4 days before bleeding, you've got a little bit of kind of sporadic, again, symptom reporting there, and similar ones are causing similar kind of problems. What they also did in this study, which I think was quite nice, they asked the athletes when they perceived their physical fitness to be best and worst, and when they perceived their performance to be best and worst. And what's quite interesting, if you look at the figures on the left-hand side that talks about their best perceived physical fitness at the top and best perceived performance underneath, what I've kind of highlighted in grey there is that half or more than half of the athletes felt that there was no change, or that they didn't know, or that they didn't notice any change in physical fitness or performance across any particular phase. And the other half of the athletes who did perceive some kind of best physical fitness or performance are kind of spread across the 4 phases. And you can see that kind of best performance appears to be in phase 3, phase 2 as well, but there's a little bit of a spread there, and the same with the fitness. And that's quite similar if you look across on the right hand side: worst perceived physical fitness, worst perceived performance. In terms of performance, half of them didn't know or didn't kind of feel any change, but you can see that there's quite a few there matching up with the symptoms, that the worst perceived performance is in that bleeding phase or premenstrual, 1 to 4 days before bleeding. So that doesn't really match up with, if you ask the athletes themselves, and in relation to their symptoms, that doesn't really match up with those systematic reviews and meta-analyses that say that there is no change in performance across the phases. If you actually ask the athletes, they might feel that there is, and for some of them, there might well be. But that's, again, why we come back to the need of this individualised approach. This is just a quick case study, something that I work on with my kind of consultancy job. So it's just a very similar example of something that we've done here. And you can see in the figure quite similar. This is worst and average, so worst in red, average in sort of grey-blue, pain of symptoms over the past year, including contraceptive users and naturally menstruating women, and that's symptom pain out of 10. And that's per individual. They're not different symptoms, that's just per individual within the squad that we were analysing in this particular report. And they reported in the table on the right hand side the top 5 symptoms during phase 1 and phase 4. The symptoms were a lot less in the mid cycles, that's why I've kind of faded them out grey. But menstrual cramps were the top symptom, changes in mood or irritability. So you need to take a minute and think, okay, I've got athletes here who are having changes in mood and irritability at different times of their menstrual cycle. That might affect their mood in training, quite simply, or how they respond in training, or how they're feeling during training, how they behave, how they communicate. And we, the people around each person, then needs to adapt to that, or appreciate that, acknowledge that, and understand it when we're working with each person, each individual athlete. Some of the points at the bottom there: 10 out of 23 players, so almost half, felt that their menstrual cycle has prevented them from training or competing at their best. So that's obviously problematic for an athlete cohort, regardless of what a meta-analysis might say. That's problematic for that individual woman, that person. 4 out of 23 players have had to adapt their training or change the way they compete due to symptoms. So that requires some kind of communication, interaction with a coach or the people that they're working with to try and manage that and deal with it. 2 out of 23 players have had to miss training competition due to symptoms. So that affects the training plan as well. So these things are significant, they are relevant, and they do require conversations. They don't necessarily need to take over, but they are relevant to the whole training and competing picture for female athletes. So what about kind of practical, I guess, recommendations or helpful tips? What can we do about this? So I've kind of summarised some slides here: monitoring and managing menstrual cycles and symptoms. And this is where, in the work that we've done in any case, communication is really key. And a recent study that we did, I'll present a couple of the findings just very briefly now. We found that these kind of 3 areas were affecting a lack of communication on this topic. One area was a lack of knowledge. We've already seen that we haven't got great research in this space, so we can't really expect athletes and coaches to have amazing knowledge if the literature just isn't there. Interpersonal relationships are tricky. So we found in this cohort that I'm going to show you in a minute of elite athletes and coaches, we measured the coach-athlete relationships within those partnerships, and they were really strong. These are world-class athletes that have been working with their coaches for a long time, very competent, highly qualified coaches. There was no problem with the coach-athlete relationships, but nevertheless, the interpersonal relationships between those parties made it difficult to talk about a topic that's quite personal, could be sensitive, is considered still taboo. So that's what that kind of portion related to. And then structured forums, there just wasn't space to have these kind of discussions. They're not built into kind of training camps or coach athlete conversations that they might have weekly or daily. And also these things don't necessarily come up in coach education programs either. So there's no kind of structured formats for coaches to learn, athletes to learn about all the kind of topics that we've been talking about here. This is quickly back to the Guru-Ström-Solly paper that I showed you a minute ago, because they got some nice data on this as well. In that paper, they showed that less than a third of the athletes, and I said it was 140 well-trained endurance athletes, communicated with their coaches about the menstrual cycle. That number was slightly higher if the athletes had a female coach and lower if the athletes had a male coach. So that issue does exist. Some of the reasons that they said that broaching the subject was found to be difficult were because my coach is a man. So straight away, we've got kind of a gender challenge. And then, yeah, this is quite common as well in several studies. It's private, it's taboo, uncomfortable, embarrassing. And only 8% of the athletes in that study reported having sufficient knowledge about the menstrual cycle in relationship to training and performance. This is the study that we did. We did this with 13 Swedish national team cross-country skiers. So that's just the environment that I've spent quite a lot of time working in the last 10 or so years, and 8 of their coaches. So I mentioned that they're high-level athletes, high-level coaches. They're also senior level athletes. And I'd already kind of mentioned that knowledge into personal factors and structural factors impacting upon the lack of communication around this topic. So some of the athletes had said to us in that paper that we've kind of reported in that paper that they'd been told, if you have your period, then you're not training enough, which is obviously incorrect. They've been told that that's what happens when you train a lot, your period will disappear. That's also bad information being sent to athlete cohorts. On that interpersonal, one of the athletes said that when she was younger, she'd say to the coach that she had a stomach ache. So it's just that use of language. She wouldn't dare to say that she was on her period. One of the male coaches, one of the quotes from them was that he said, us guys are a bit more out of our depth. There's an extra barrier, so you need even more trust. And then coming on to that kind of structural component that I mentioned, there's a lack of formal education and organised forums relating to female hormonal topics. So a paper that we've done to follow up on that is we've gone in with younger athletes, because these were senior, and they said we needed this work done with us when we were younger. Like now we're in our 20s, one of them was in her 30s, she was coming towards the end of her career. So we've gone in to work with 16 to 20-year-olds, and we've kind of done a real action research type of intervention where we talk to the coaches and the athletes together. We develop a intervention with them to try to help educate them, try to improve their communication around actually a broader set of stigmatized health topics, not just the menstrual cycle. We've got boys in that study as well. We're looking at kind of mental health issues, disordered eating issues, and then also kind of hormonal issues that affect both young women and young men. And this is kind of a model, and the purpose of putting this up is even if you're very practical based, even if you're a coach and you're working in the field, you need ways to kind of think about how to go about this. So what we do is we kind of evaluate where we're at the moment, what is the knowledge level, and then we're kind of going in with some expertise to try to educate coaches and athletes. We'll have focus group discussions that have proven to be really, really important. We'll have athletes on their own without the coaches. We'll have coaches on their own without the athletes, and then we'll combine the coaches and the athletes so that we're really opening up the conversations around all of these topics. Then we'll kind of do a follow-up, and you can kind of continue to do that. And it doesn't need to be a huge takeover intervention. It just needs to be little and often and frequent, and making sure that something rather than nothing is being done. So I think I'm just going to spend the last few minutes kind of wrapping up with a few practical examples or suggestions, and then hopefully we can kind of open up for some discussion and questions. Tracking cycles is really important because we've already talked about that kind of need for individualization. All athletes are different, so you really need to spend time or your athletes need to spend time, female athletes need to spend time building up like a database of information about what our menstrual cycles are looking like, whether we're hormonal contraceptive users and what's going on with our symptoms and our bleeds around that. So the first recommendation is to continuously monitor and record cycles and symptoms, and that includes when bleeding's occurring, any mood swings that are occurring, positive or negative, energy levels, and there's lots of different apps that can be used to help for that. That allows you to kind of identify cycle patterns and characteristics over time in terms of bleeding, length of bleeding, amount of bleeding, length of cycle, when symptoms typically occur. And that allows you to start thinking about interventions of what you can do to minimise the effect of symptoms or kind of performance effects or effects on training. Communicate openly about the menstrual cycle is just really important to, we talk all the time, we use this kind of term, open up the conversation. It's just another part of what a female athlete in any case has to go through from day to day, the same as she has to figure out her sleep, her nutrition, her recovery. It's just another component that's super important for us, but it's not the only component, but it's not a component that we can afford to ignore. And just don't expect women or girls, like individuals, to be comparable, because we've said it quite a few times now, they're very different. There's very different experiences for each person, and even each individual will have different experiences from month to month and over longer periods of time throughout a lifespan. I think John mentioned that I work for Orico, so the reason of putting this one up is just because we've actually got a really nice app that I think is quite useful. So if you're looking for one, this is good. There are others available, but Fitter Women that I work with, it enables athletes to track their periods and their symptoms. It also provides kind of tailored nutrition guidance and other educational materials. So I think it's quite useful just to gather sort of resources and a basic level of information, but it allows as well trends to be developed and athletes to have a really good idea of when they can expect their next bleeds to occur, and you can kind of predict the future. The more quality information you put in over a longer period of time, the better those predictions are going to be. So you can do tracking, like I said, recommendations, there's lots of resources, and you've got trends there. And something else I think is really, this is really novel, this is unique to our particular service, is that we've got like a Fitter Coach app as well, which enables a coach to have a platform like a Training Peaks or some kind of training diary online kind of platform where they can have all of their athletes in one system. All of the athletes' data will automatically go into this kind of coaching platform so that you can see what's going on with each of your athletes. You can look at their symptoms, you can see when they're due to be on their periods or where they're likely to have kind of negative and positive symptoms, moods, and effects from their menstrual cycles. So I think that's just a really nice, useful platform for anyone kind of working with groups of female athletes. And I've put this up because this is a paper that I published with some colleagues just last year, actually. And in that paper, it's around menstrual health literacy, the paper itself. But there's a table in there where we tried to collect together examples of, as the title says there, menstrual health information and educational resources. And we tried to get them from reliable sources, so just national sport organisations and trustworthy kind of research groups, because there's obviously loads of stuff on the internet now. There's lots of people trying to sell education around this. Some of which are better than others. So there's just some kind of platforms there that have collected resources or information to try to help coaches, practitioners, researchers, or just athletes themselves as well in this kind of menstrual health literacy space. And then I've put up a couple of just handles, Period of the Period or Claire Baden-Horst. They're just Claire's somebody that I work with, just kind of reliable places. I think it's important to think, where can I go to get good information on, be it Instagram or Twitter or wherever it might be. So to summarise, and there's quite a few points on here, but hopefully everything that I've said already leads into this somewhat naturally. We can just have a look through this before I wrap up. There are distinct sex differences, obviously, between women and men, with female sex hormones fluctuating over 21 to 35 days for eumenoric, naturally menstruating women, and that obviously doesn't occur in men. So that's kind of one of the key differences. At a group level, so we've talked about kind of on average in groups, physiological and performance responses don't appear to differ across the different hormonal phases of the menstrual cycle. However, responses do differ greatly between and within female athletes. And also female athletes experience hormonal cycle-related symptoms, which can affect their training and performance. And these symptoms and experiences differ greatly both between and within athletes. And that means that we need to adopt kind of individual approaches when we're supporting female athletes. And how can we do that? Well, there's menstrual cycle tracking apps that can help us to build up a database of information, and some of them also provide kind of evidence-based advice and recommendations. And in general, improving our menstrual health literacy is going to be fundamental to helping our female athletes develop and provide the best knowledge, information that we can to support their performance and health. That's all from me. So I think the best thing to do is probably stop sharing and see if there's kind of some questions or discussion to wrap up with.
Kerry, thanks for that.
Did you catch it all?
Yes, I did. Apart from the short 30 seconds when the delivery guy called.
Okay.
But I'll listen back to that. Okay, folks, you have a good opportunity now to ask some questions. Just drop them into the Q&A there if you have. Seems to me, I'll just lead off while I'm waiting for a couple to come through, Kerry. The kind of, I guess, one kind of unifying theme here is the need for education. Who's leading the charge in that, in terms of like NGBs or world bodies, and how advanced is that education at the moment?
Well, I can just answer from my perspective. I mean, things like this are brilliant. I'm invited probably every week to do something like this for some kind of group or other, and I'm not really saying no to any of them, which is kind of killing me. But at the same time, I think it's so important and it's brilliant. So I just really like the way that university kind of seminar series are putting these things in, which is great. I've been asked to do one recently by the International Ski Federation, because that's close to the work I do, by the International Biathlon Federation, by the British Triathlon Coach Education Programme for high performing coaches, by the Swedish Sport Confederation. These are just in the last, I would say, couple of months from me personally. And I'm obviously not the only person doing this. So I think there's kind of developing experts who are being asked to do this all over the place, but it does feel somewhat ad hoc. I try to, I guess, encourage educational institutions, whether it's like master program, undergraduate programs. This needs to be a part of our education within sports science, but it also needs to be part of our kind of coach education. I don't know if it's just somewhat ad hoc. I've got several colleagues that are doing this kind of work. Natalie Brown, who was the first author on one of the papers, she's employed by Sport Wales. So she's through Swansea University, and one of her jobs there, one of her main jobs, is actually she goes out and educates a lot of younger girls and young women within kind of schooling systems. I'm on a kind of an Adidas Breaking Barriers Innovation Lab project where I've just been with a couple of Irish people who've got kind of an education set up. They've got an organisation where they're going into lots and lots of schools in Ireland, for example, to try to educate younger people. But yeah, I don't know if that helps, because so I don't know about organised strategies. It's very difficult to organise people. So I don't know if that's good enough what we're doing. there's a lot more chat about it, which is great, and there's a lot more people educating about it, which is great, but I don't know how we make sure that it systematically is within our systems, I guess, is the answer.
I guess it's such a kind of a neglected, gaping kind of hole in our whole science around performance. And I was just wondering, was there any NGBs who do this well? Like, you know, up to not too distant past, I was involved with a lot of female endurance athletes, and there was nothing, you know, from a governing body perspective in the coach education. I'm wondering, has that changed over the past few years? Are things moving in the right direction? Is it still a black hole?
It's definitely changing because it's being talked about a lot more. So, I mean, you could have a quick look on the one that I just mentioned with the International Ski Federation. They've put together a seminar series over the whole year, for example, where I'm one of 8 or 10 speakers speaking like monthly on different female hormonal specific topics. So I think I had a lecture that was specific to menstrual health literacy. Emma Ross has got one, Johanna Ichalainen, who's on one of my papers, like, you know, people who are working in this field. So that's the International Ski Federation specifically, who I know are doing good things, and they've got somebody in place who's kind of leading the charge, as it were, for that federation. I'm not too sure what the IOC, for example, are doing on this. They seem to not quite know the definition of female athlete at the minute, so I'm not too sure it's going to work. But that's a whole side topic that we won't get involved in. But yeah, so and like I said, with the Swedish Sport Confederation, they've got a webinar series throughout this whole year as well. I think they've got 8 expert speakers. And that was across the lifespan. So they've got kind of adolescence, they've got menopause, they've got the aging, the elderly woman. I had one there about training and performance and menstrual cycles, etc., etc.
Yeah, I guess to me it still feels like it's kind of ad hoc, and I guess my focus is more on the coach education, and I'm not sure how much of that is getting through. I've a question from one of the audience members, if that's okay. Unless you want to comment on that last piece.
No, I'll just comment. I think it's really important for other people to remind me how bad it still is, because I've become so involved in it. I've probably got a really biased and somewhat rose-tinted view of how great it's all going, because I'm talking about it every single day now. Whereas, like you just said, probably outside of my world, it's still pretty bad. So I just have to kind of keep remembering that as well.
Okay. So this is a question from Jan Booton.
Oh, yeah.
Do you have any experience or knowledge about how athletes deal with their symptoms in practice to avoid negative impact on training performance?
Yeah, I do, because that's quite a big part of my job at Oracle. So we've got clients who are typically elite female athletes, whether they're teams or individuals. And the work that we do with them is to specifically, so we'll kind of have a screening questionnaire with them. Then we've got them all on the Fitter Woman app. Then we've also used the Fitter Coach platform with them, if necessary, if they're in a kind of coached environment. And then we actually feed back to the coaches that are working with them about how to manage things. So, I mean, some of that might be nutritional interventions, for example. Some of it might be just how to change and manage their training if they're somebody that struggles quite badly. So some of them might be exercise and kind of training related. There's different things that you can do, but there's no research on that. And that's actually the study that I'm currently starting to roll out this year, is a kind of mixed methods qual study of what elite athletes are actually doing in practice and how effective it is. And the follow-up study to that will then be an intervention study to try to look at how much of an impact can we actually have by trying to positively manage negative symptoms or make the most of positive symptoms. So I think that's another thing that we really overlook is, you know, for half of the month, on average-ish, we're sort of above average, we're doing great. And for the other half, we're kind of feeling a bit worse and maybe not responding as well. So we really need to maximize the positive side of this as well, and not only focus on the negative side.
Okay, and just looking back at Jan's question, is there kind of a, and I know this is incredibly generalized, so don't answer it if it's too general, but are there kind of 3 to 5 top strategies that female endurance or any athlete could use to, if they are experiencing bad symptoms at certain times, to counteract those? Like, what would be the most common strategies that ladies would use?
I just think it's really variable. I do think it's variable. Yeah, I mean, anti-inflammatory foods is kind of one key one that we would focus on, because you've got inflammation in different phases that is affecting those symptoms. Different types of movement, so stretching or mobility or not doing hard training sessions. I mean, that's going to be the other main one. It's managing the training and the movement, and it's managing the nutrition, I would say. Hydration is one as well. Sleep is another one.
So, I mean, sorry, just because, like, they're all good athletic habits. So, you know, I guess good basic athletic habits are going to help.
Yeah.
To some degree.
Yeah, and you've got there's kind of different metabolism as well at different times, so that it might be that you focus a little bit more on your carbohydrate intake versus your protein intake in phase 2 and 3, like in your luteal and follicular phase. Yeah, so good habits, but I guess, yeah, the inflammation is something that's quite specific to the phase that you can manage with specific types of anti-inflammatory foods.
Okay, one other kind of brief question from me, and then we'll wrap it up. Female athletes have been kind of bombarded with negative messaging around their cycle for forever. Surely all that kind of negative messaging and that kind of anticipation of negative outcomes or negative effects must be very detrimental to, you know, not just the mindset, but the, you know, physiology. So I guess it's going back to one of your key points is, like, you need to educate this, and you need to highlight that it's not all necessarily, it's not negative. It's, you know, so I don't know if you've any comment on that, but I'm just thinking about the kind of psycho-emotional impact of this cultural male-dominated negativity towards menstrual cycle.
Yeah, and like one of the words that's often bandied around now that are used in presentations is this kind of superpower, use your superpower, and this kind of idea that, like I said, I guess that, you know, we've got an average state, and yeah, sure, for half the month we might be below average, and for the other half of the month we're above average, but it's just kind of trying to pull us up here or make the most of those scenarios and manage those symptoms. But the other thing is that these things really affect dropout in adolescence, for example, like the complete lack of communication and education around young women, people who are just starting to menstruate, and they've got this, you know, they've got these scenarios where they're embarrassed at school, that's kind of, then they go off doing sport. So I think it's key how we talk to and how we encourage our young female athletes and make sure that they're well educated and also understand that that's one phase of their life, because at that time in their life as well, they tend to, their body composition changes, that they will start to have more fat mass on their body, which will then kind of disappear as they get older and become leaner and get more muscle mass, for example, potentially. So, yeah, I mean, without being aware of any of these things, we're not going to take care of them. But to me, it's like basic that you need to talk positively to athletes around this, as you would with anything else around training and nutrition and recovery. So I don't think it's any different from any other factor that we have to deal with as coaches and practitioners. But like you said, like we have to get it into our kind of education syllabuses. Otherwise, what's going to happen? It's going to continue to be a negative spiral.
Perfect. I don't know if you're okay for time. A couple of questions. I won't say they just popped in. I've just seen them. Is it okay?
Yeah, no, it's fine for me.
Okay, so here's one from Ian Kennedy, who works in the department. Is there evidence that female athletes have had to pick and choose events based on their cycle dates? Now, I presume we're talking about championships, Olympics, etc.
Well, that last slide that I didn't sort of say out loud, but I don't know if you had time to see it, the one with Emma Pallant-Brown, she's a triathlete, and it kind of just said that, you know, gold medals, world records have been set, you know, all days of the menstrual cycle. So it doesn't seem that performance is actually affected, but as you also saw from the slides in the presentation, the athletes feel like their performance is affected, and they've got things going on in their body that they'll feel bloated, they've got tummy ache, they've got backache, they've got muscle pain, they've got things going on that don't feel good and make you feel, shit, I'm going to have a terrible race or competition today. So that comes back to the education again, and it comes back to the psychology and the mindset. And, you know, I'm somebody that I've learned a hell of a lot about this in the last 5 years, and I approach my performance around my menstrual cycle completely differently, because now I know that, yeah, I feel like shit, you know, because some days you do feel bad, even as a male athlete, you feel bad, you go and race and you set a PB or you have a blinder, despite the fact that prior to the event, you didn't feel like you were going to, you didn't feel good, you felt like an off day, so you can surprise yourself. So you've got to separate the perceptions from the performance itself. And that comes down to the coaching and the psychology and the education, and making your athlete feel and understand that she can perform on that day. That said, you know, some athletes will manipulate their menstrual cycles. It's not something that I think that we should, based on all the evidence that we've got, I don't think it's something that we need to be putting front and center or really focusing too much on, because I don't think there's any evidence that you're gonna perform better or worse if you've got your period or not. That said, some athletes are hugely heavy bleeders, they have hugely negative symptoms around their periods, they're just either not going to perform or they're going to feel so anxious about bleeding out, you know what I mean, that it's going to be problematic. So it might be that if you've got the choice, yeah, you can manipulate your race season around things to some extent. You can't move the Olympics, you can't move the world champs. If you're a team sport athlete, you're competing twice a week, or you can't move the World Cup. So there's lots of practical places where you can't do that. So sure, do it where possible if necessary, but don't let it take over in your athlete's mind so that she's going to have an awful race or an awful match or competition because she's on her period at a certain time, because that's just in reality not the case. And then worst case scenario, you can medically manipulate when you're going to have a period. If the Olympics is coming up, you're a terrible bleeder, you've got terrible symptoms, and you're a marathon runner, for example, or whatever, swimmer, whatever.
Okay, perfect. Now, thank you very much. Frank, I don't know if you want to jump in and wrap up.